Okay, in this video I'm going to show you how to put a little Star Wars into your Space Marine officers or other figures that have markings. And I'm starting off of this blue mix that you can easily replace with Games Workshop's Cantor Blue, I found out. But I didn't have that, so I put in my own mix. After I applied the base colors, I'm also showing you how I did the highlighting for the blue. If you want to get to the meat of the matter, just see the markings and the banged up approach to these. Skip forward to the 16-minute mark. But here I'm just gradually adding ash and blue to the mix, and I'm highlighting first, obviously covering more area and then covering less and less, and bringing back both the shades with some washes and glazes, and I'm also generally making the transition smoother with that. Now you can see me putting in the highlight color on special areas right here on the top of the head and on all the edges. And I gradually cover less and less area with the lighter colors. As always, for the face mask, I'm dividing it into two pieces or two halves, and I'm making one of them really bright and the other one darker because it's a really dramatic effect. And then you can see me gradually making the highlights on top of the helmet brighter, and I'm just working on creating the overall light situation. And I do that gradually, mixing in more and more ash and blue, and then later some of that wolf gray. Again, usually starting with the edges and then kind of sketching in lights, especially on the sides here of the helmet, where these round long objects are, sort of like where the ears go. And you can see that I'm just repeating the steps, gradually moving higher and higher. Top of the head, edges, and then the sides of the ears. Making sure that it makes for an interesting reflection pattern. And slightly tilting the light source to the left side of this. That's why I focus mainly on the left side of the helmet. Obviously you can highlight that a bit more globally, but that's just what I decided for this example. Now there's different ways to work on these transitions. Here I'm stippling on, like smoother, or creating smoother transitions that way. And since I'm going to glaze over the whole thing to make the gradient smoother, it's not that much of a big deal if this is not smooth right away. So just making the overall light situation more intense, covering more areas, also including secondary reflections. I'm leaving out the mohawk on top because that's going to be covered by the markings anyway. And then turning it around, I also make sure that all edges receive some highlighting. Obviously, even though these edges face down, I also want to have them covered for the sake of contrast. And then I'm starting to smooth out the gradients using a medium blue to bring out the intensity again. Since I'm highlighting with Ashen Blue, it can turn somewhat gray, so this gives back the overall blue, a more intense blue, and it makes the gradient smoother, obviously. Definitely is a rather thin glaze consistency. It's not really washed because I am covering all the areas, even the higher areas, and I don't want it to just sit in the recesses. Brings up the darker parts a bit and brings down the lighter parts a bit and smooths everything out. So I'm doing that until I'm satisfied with how the gradients and the color turns out. And then I'm moving to Nightshade Purple for the shadows, which just turned out to be a really good color to shade blue with. It's a really dark purple, and here I'm just obviously touching the very dark areas where I want a lot of contrast. So applying it more selectively in the crevices. And also, like I said, the darker half of the face mask right next to the lightest line of the other half. I'm also applying a darker line, and then I'm just dark lining the pipings too, and everything that I feel needs to be distinguished from the rest. Dark lining the sides of the mohawk, but it's going to be covered anyway, just out of habit. Which, you know, if it was just a blue helmet, I would definitely also dark line these sides of the quote-unquote mohawk, because that's an area that should have a lot of contrast. Now after I did that, I decided to bring some areas lighter up. I kind of neglected the back of the helmet here. Again, putting in lights or putting in highlights and paying special attention to the edges until I'm happy. So sometimes we lose some of the edge highlights when we apply the glazes and the dark lining, so I'm bringing that back out again. Also to the edges that face downwards, I'm paying some attention and make sure that they are smooth and that they are separating my elements, especially above the eyes, since the eyes are going to be darker, at least on that edge. So the upper edge of the eyes, the very upper edge, is going to be black lined, and then on top of that I'm going to paint the eyes. So I'm making sure that these are distinguished from the blue. Then more selectively applying a few glazes where I want everything a bit darker. So on top where the curve of the round helmet moves down, bends downwards, I want that to be a shade almost, or at least a bit darker than the very high points of that curve. And eventually I decided the back needs a bit more lights to keep the contrast situation high, and I took a mid-tone and just worked over that, and after that I applied a second highlight in the middle of what I did now. Yeah, just again moving the brush in that line pattern simulates light reflected. And here you can see I mixed in some of that wolf gray again and applying my last highlight to all the areas. Almost pure wolf gray here to maximize contrast. And then the next video, the next basics video, I'm going to cover why it's not always wise to use a lot of white. So what you see here is I'm just putting in a reflex point. That's going to be enough to indicate that there's a reflective surface that has one point that is very reflective. There's an off-white in there, and I'm just covering very little space, not too much. That's to avoid chalkiness, but that's only one way to avoid chalkiness, but we're going to talk that in the next video. Again, for the sake of contrast, I'm just touching the very high up areas that will catch a lot of light. In a face, it would be the back of the nose, for example, so I'm putting a reflex point on the top of the face mask, and also to the bottom of these curves that face down and that curve up again, which I think should be highlighted because there's going to be a lot of light being reflected sort of on a meeting point of two edges, so that would be really intense. And also, of course, on the face mask edges that face up below the eyes, putting the light dot right in the middle of both negative curves, and you can see here on positive curves too. So everything that curves up will have a reflex point on the highest point, and everything that curves down will have a reflex point on the lowest point, as always. Starting with the markings, I'm mixing wolf gray with white. I'm using my ink white, my Schmincke acrylic ink, and has proven to be the best white for me because of its flow, but it's still opaque, and just, you know, the way it behaves while applying it, and also the way it mixes, and, you know, to avoid some chalkiness. It has high pigmentation, but the pigments seem to be small, so that's to avoid chalkiness as well. And it just worked out. You can see I don't have to put the brush down a lot. I feel like with artist acrylics I have to do that a lot because it dries out the brush. But this ink format kind of helps me to, especially when doing freehands, move more freely. Obviously I'm mixing in a bit of wolf gray so that I have the option to apply a highlight with pure white. And here you can see I'm just focusing on getting the edges straight. So just gauging how wide I want to go, and then slowly making these lines, or pulling those lines a bit more outwards. Definitely want to clear up or clean up some of those parts later, which is fine, you know. Putting a bit of a darker line next to these markings will actually help us making them stand out. So just building the pattern, making sure my lines are sharp as possible before cleaning them up. The sharper you get them, the less cleaning up you have to do, which, you know, always adds additional room for mistakes, so you want to be as precise as possible on the first pass. Also covering the top of what I call the mohawk, and then since I have the width established that I want this white stripe to be, I'm also doing that on the back. and I decided to pull my markings all the way down, which makes for an interesting effect here in the back with the two circles that are in a bit of an indent, and it's going to look interesting. So here you can see I'm picking out my highlight color for that blue, and I'm correcting the edge of the white markings. I'm just making sure that my tip is very pointy, and then just dragging it across the line and cleaning up that edge. Next up, I'm adding the red markings using clothed red, and also preparing some Mephiston red for later for the highlights. And basically doing the same, starting in the middle, checking out how wide I want this marking to be, and then gradually making it wider and wider until I reach a point where I think the width is good, and then I'm applying a second and a third layer in this case, because coverage wasn't all that good for some reason. Pretty straightforward. Slowly making sure it has the correct width, and then covering all the areas that should be covered until that stripe is also has some good coverage and no white shining through anymore. Again, cleaning up the sides with the color below, because for some reason I really suck at painting straight lines, so I always need that step. If you're good with painting lines that don't have any disturbances, then you can totally skip that step. Okay. Yeah, I kind of like that. It definitely needs more contrast here and there. So we also are going to scratch it up. Let's see. I want to shade the white a bit. See if that's a good color. Could be a bit too light. I was looking for that stupid word. Yeah, so I don't. That's what the heavy metal studio would probably do, and I usually don't like all of their approaches, but that kind of looks good. So I think I want to add more gray, so let's maybe go for a bit more of a gray approach. So right now it's blue. Feels like that kind of bites with the blue below, so I'm just going to add one layer of gray. And then of course we need to think about whether or not to highlight the red. Let's see, I'm probably going to put in a small highlight, just fixing this line here. Okay, double checking. All my lines. Messed up my shading here. So I need to bring that back out. Yeah, that looks okay. Just this side of red has a bit of a dent. Should be fixed now. Okay, let's see. Let's add a bit of that lighter red. I kind of like the blood red feel that it has to it now, so this could look a bit too. But in general, I would definitely put some highlights there. So maybe it's needed. I think it's subtle enough. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with blue again. Let's mix that somewhere here. because I want to soak the brush a bit more in and paint so that it's pulling from the reservoir. And I'm going to start putting down scratches that run from the blue into the white. It should be darker. So just very thin lines. Can also bang up those edges a bit. Maybe even go for some black, just to be darker. I know that part kind of hates me. Scratches, well, at least when done on these edges up here. I always feel like I can't really put too much color on there. Always feels like it's it's not opaque enough. And that takes away from the effect. Just using the wider or the length of the brush usually helps with that. But yeah, obviously I want to simulate that the white is on top of the blue, and color on top of the blue, and when it gets banged up and leaves scratch marks and then leaves the blue to shine through. Right, and mix up like dots and scratches. Maybe some lighter bits. And also bang up the blue a bit. Okay, and last step, do the same with the white and the red. But to take some pure ink color. Just so it's more opaque. And typically I use, for example, this scratch kind of moves into the blue too, and then I also make it longer up into the white, so it feels like, okay, that same hit or whatever, that was scratched up the whole area and didn't just hit the blue, but it didn't just hit the top, but it also hit the white and also the blue, but it was not as hard to scrape away all layers. It just scraped over all layers but did not scrape away all of them. Do that here too. Okay, so I don't want to overdo it. Obviously, some damage is good. Too much can look weird. Yeah, I think I like that.